Fantastic. I'm really looking forward to the next talk. It's from the IRR, which is a South African think tank that aims to promote individual liberty, democracy, the rule of law, and free market economics. All very Bitcoin-specific topics. I think you're really going to enjoy it. Now, John Endres is the CEO of the International Race Relations Community? Just IR. Organization. We're going with organization. And he's coming here today to talk, I hope, about how Bitcoin overlaps with this organization in some shape or form. So please give a really warm welcome to John Endres. And John, the floor is yours. Take it away. Do you want this or do you want that? You can use either. I'll use this one. Okay, great. Take this here. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Yes, well, what an amazing experience this has been for me. I'm not deep in the Bitcoin ecosystem, on the fringes somewhat, but have been fascinated to hear what you've been talking about, what you're involved in, what's going on here. So today I'll speak to you about the social drivers of Bitcoin adoption and making the case for South Africa. I know there's some South Africans in the audience, but also quite a few foreign guests, and I thought it might be a good idea to give you an overview of our history, where the country finds itself at the moment, and what sort of factors I'm seeing that could drive Bitcoin adoption in South Africa. So it's a bit of a social take on a technological phenomenon. And why I think it's important is that as evangelists and convinced Bitcoiners, you might be wondering why not everybody is using Bitcoin yet. And of course, the reason for that is social. It's because human beings are social animals. We change our ways not always easily, and therefore that actually matters quite a bit. Just to talk a little bit about the IRR, the South African Institute of Race Relations was founded in 1929. It's South Africa's oldest think tank, and probably also one of the oldest classically liberal think tanks in the world. And the motto is that we stand for classical liberalism, an effective way to defeat poverty and tyranny through a system of limited government, a market economy, private enterprise, freedom of speech, individual liberty, property rights, and the rule of law. And I think you'll immediately see that there's an overlap there with Bitcoin. We've seen a bit of the tyranny of government in the form of manipulation of currencies through inflation, for example, or also through freezing assets of dissidents, making it difficult for people to stay in control of their money. So there is a use case for Bitcoin within this space of maintaining independence from government overreach. Very quickly, we'll go through today's South Africa is better in many ways, and I'll explain why I have to say that. I'll speak a little bit about the setbacks since 1994, get into our government's service delivery problems, then talk very briefly about the general social drivers of Bitcoin adoption before closing with the factors that make South Africa, I think, a distinctive environment when it comes to Bitcoin. So our starting point needs to be that we had, of course, apartheid, the system of racial segregation from 1948 to about 1994, when the democratic government, the ANC government, was elected for the first time. And the situation before that transition was very grim, because there were not universal property rights. There was no universal freedom of speech. You were not free to choose where to live, who to marry, what profession to pursue. So there were really extreme restrictions on freedoms. And what the 1994 transition brought was equal constitutionally guaranteed rights and freedoms. So South Africans are, the South African Constitution specifies this in the Bill of Rights, that all South Africans are equal and enjoy the equal rights and freedoms. We have a very high degree of freedom of expression, which is not always the case across the continent, but here in South Africa you can be critical of the government and nothing will happen to you. You can express whatever ideas are on your mind very freely, and that is a great strength and an asset. We also have these fundamental freedoms of association, of movement, of belief. As I said, before 1994, there were restrictions on all these things on the basis of race, and that is something that we have overcome. But if you speak to South Africans today, you'll feel that there's a certain sense of gloom and worry and concern about the future, despite having achieved that transition to greater freedom. And the reason for that is that there have been a lot of administrative and governance failings, especially since about 2007, 2008. So to give you just some of the headline stats, unemployment in South Africa at 41% is off the charts. It's a completely crazy level. It's about triple the second highest unemployment rate in the world if you track the countries that track that information reliably. Very, very high unemployment. Inequality, which is one of the metrics that the government has tried to target since 1994, trying to bring down inequality between South Africans, has actually increased since 1994. 45% of the population receive social grants. So there's 16 million people with jobs in South Africa, and there's about 28 million people receiving social grants, with 50% of all households receiving at least one social grant, and 25% of households having social grants as their main source of income. So that's not a really stable situation to be in, as you can imagine. GDP per capita is down since 2008 in real terms, so it means people are actually getting poorer in South Africa. It's also driving a lot of the frustration, the unhappiness, because people can sense it in their pockets. Load shedding has been mentioned a few times. We do like to make fun of it, make light of it, but it is a very serious problem. It's not just an inconvenience. What it is a cap on economic growth. So imagine, the economy wants to expand, factories want to produce more stuff, tourism operators want to offer more services to tourists, and they can't because there's not enough power. So every single time you see the economy trying to grow a little bit, load shedding comes back with a vengeance and throttles the growth. So growth has been at 1.2% average since 2008, which is really mediocre. Much of the infrastructure is collapsing. Passenger rail traffic has dropped by 95%, which is completely insane. We're having huge problems also in other forms of transport. The national flag carrier, South African Airways, has had several near-death experiences and is sort of still stumbling along, surprisingly, but is actually a zombie airline, I think, that deserves to be put underground and for private carriers to take its place. And finally, something that's also been much in the news recently, we've got huge problems with our freight rail and ports. South Africa's a very big commodity exporter of coal, of iron ore, of other metals and minerals. And for that you need heavy rail in order to get the stuff out, and of course the ports as well. And there are huge problems at all those transport hubs and destinations. So we're losing out as a country. And the way it looks in practice is that you see in many municipalities the roads not being maintained and falling apart, crumbling apart. You're not going to see as much of that here in Cape Town, which is run by a different party, which is maintaining the infrastructure much better. You see traffic lights being cut down for metal and being stripped. You see water interruptions where people for days on end do not have a water supply in their taps. The taps are dry. And often, as has been mentioned in a previous briefing, the water is also contaminated. So we've had cases of cholera. I think Russell was speaking about that yesterday, which really shouldn't be happening in a country like South Africa with an elaborate infrastructure that is just not being maintained. And finally, waste collection, also not great in many areas. So if you're outside of the Western Cape, you feel this very strongly. It does feel that the country is on the wrong track. Now, what has the response been of South Africans to this? It's been actually really interesting. So this is the society's response to state failure. Public education is a mess. 81% of grade 4 pupils can't read for meaning, even in their own home language. Crazy. But what many people then do is that they seek recourse by going to the private schooling system. And that's not only for middle class and wealthy people. Even poorer people seek private schools at low fees in order not to be exposed to the really bad public education system. Similarly, in healthcare, many of the public hospitals in the rest of the country are really badly run with really scandalous conditions, long waiting times, patients not being treated properly. And many people, if they can, try to have private healthcare and private medical insurance. If you're able to afford that, you enjoy some of the best medical insurance in the world and medical treatment in the world, to such an extent that people come from the United States or from Europe to South Africa on a medical safari, for example. So the private sector is really stepping in where the state is failing. Policing is a mess. That doesn't work very well. Law enforcement agencies are politicized. They're often corrupt. They're ineffective. So you get private security companies, and there's over 10 times more private security agents now in South Africa than there are policemen, police officers, police women. Water supply is harder to avoid state failure, but even here you see people, if they can, using boreholes or large water storage containers if they can't rely on the water supply from the municipality. Electricity, if you can't get power from the outlet, you put solar on your roof if you can afford it, you buy a generator, you find a solution, you make it work somehow. And municipal service delivery, another example. In the area I live in, Johannesburg, municipal services are almost invisible, absent. And what then happens is that private associations, residents associations, get together and do much of the work that the state should actually be doing. Maintaining the area clean, cutting the long grass, fixing potholes, and just making sure that things keep on working. This sometimes reaches quite astonishing proportions. One example here is that in Johannesburg, even the firefighting services are failing. So where there should be a fleet of fire trucks across the city, most of those are not working, and there are now private firefighting services that you can add on to your private security company subscription, and your fire will be put out if you have the service, if you're a subscriber to the service. So this is a kind of special environment, I think, when speaking about Bitcoin, because this is a society that is used to state failure. It is used to becoming not very well served by government, and it's used to finding its own solutions to the problems that present themselves. In my initial version of the briefing, this was my main slide, social drivers of Bitcoin adoption. But many of these social drivers I find are generic because they apply in many other countries as well. So economic uncertainty, sure, you don't know if you're going to have a job, what your income is going to be, and so you might want to have Bitcoin as a backup solution. Demand for remittances, a huge deal. We've got a very large migrant population in South Africa, including from Zimbabwe, for example, across the border. And for people working here to send money back home is very expensive in fees of the amount that is being sent back. So you're really losing out. It's difficult to help your family back home when that much of your money, of the little money that you're earning, is being consumed by fees. So being able to do this through solutions like the Aqua solution that we heard about earlier, hugely valuable. It's also true for people engaging in other cross-border transactions. We have exchange controls in South Africa, so you do need to apply to the Reserve Bank for permission to engage in international transactions. It's a hassle. There are limits on how much you can transact, and it's a limit to economic growth and deeply unpleasant. We've also got a sizable youth population and quite a tech-savvy community, as we're seeing from many of the briefings that we've heard here. And finally, there's also a very strong spirit of innovation and entrepreneurship, and all of these are useful drivers of Bitcoin adoption. But they apply in many other countries as well. So what I'd like to do, my final slide, is just to go into a little bit of what makes South Africa distinctive, in my view, having heard
Center kry nie eens load shedding nie. It's just nice. This is centers. But it can't be because center doesn't get load shedding. Yeah, I think it's the centers.
Hectic, dude.
En ons is langs in 'n hospitaal, so ons kry nie.
Okay. Hectic. Ek hoor jy maar gaan met jou chat hoor.
Okay, 100%.
En dan sê my doen julle net live streaming so dit ook doen enige editing werk.
Ja, so
ek interviews byvoorbeeld.
Ja, so ek sien basies spaar.
but I think it's useful to think about these points. The first one is distrust of government. So speaking to some of the delegates here from more developed nations, Germany, Australia, United States, I think the Bitcoin community is slightly unusual in being distrustful of government, but I think that most people in the general population are not. They're very trusting of government. And why wouldn't they be? Because, you know, things work pretty well, currency is more or less stable, you've got a decent income, services work, so you trust the government. But in South Africa, we are being trained as a result of the circumstances, I think, to be quite distrustful. And that is a useful factor if you're trying to introduce an alternative currency system, like Bitcoin, or asset class. You've also got strong civil society organizations with the freedom to operate. So we heard from Russell yesterday, from Sakalicha, that's a really wonderful organization. There's many others as well, like the IRR as well. And these are organizations that don't exist in many other countries that have undergone similar state weakening processes where the outcomes have been very bad. So if you want to avoid those really bad outcomes, you do need civil society organizations to be in there, to be resisting the breakdown, to be building, as Russell emphasized, and to be creating solutions for state failure. The private sector and private initiatives take you a long way, but they don't take you all the way. For that, you need some flanking organizations as well to produce the ideas and the concepts on how to deal with this failing state. South Africans are well known for their can-do attitude. So there's a local saying, which is, 'n boer maak 'n plan,' and that means that a farmer makes a plan. If you're somewhere out on the farm, something breaks, something doesn't work, or you want to do something, you figure it out. You make a plan, you make the thing work, and this can-do attitude, I think, we're also seeing reflected in many of the tools and solutions that are being produced by the people in this room. Like KG's example is a perfect example. You know, if you haven't got internet connectivity, well, make it work on the SMS network. Really amazing. Willfulness and obstinacy. So this seems to be a bit of a national characteristic, and I'm always reminded, if you read about the Anglo-Boer War from 1899 to 1902, the Boers knew that they wanted to resist the British, but it was very hard to organize them. So instead of creating a proper army, you'd sort of invite your neighbors whether they wanted to join the fight. And the soldiers in these Boer armies were very willful and very obstinate. So if they didn't feel like it, they wouldn't fight. If they wanted to be in a different unit, they'd just move across. And this kind of fierce individualism and will to freedom, I think, is a feature that supports the introduction of Bitcoin. It's also reflected, I think, in the long battle to overcome apartheid. South Africans have achieved a high degree of freedom at a high cost, and they value their freedom so much more because of that. And Bitcoin, being freedom money, fits into that philosophy, into that attitude. Necessity is the mother of invention, so that's true, I think, in many environments, but certainly here as well, that when you're faced with a problem, you've just got to make a plan, make it work, find a solution. And Bitcoin is a solution to many of these problems, like inflation, for example, or like difficulty in cross-border transactions, and many other problems as well. So it's really supported by that. South Africans are fascinated with technology. You'll see that from many of the presentations here as well. I think there's a great openness to adopting new forms of technology. A friend of mine moved to Dubai recently and was talking about the marvels of the advanced technologies they have there. But he said that the banking was really backward. So he says he has to make payments by check and needed people to help him complete the checks because he's never used checks before. So we adopt technology quite easily, I think, and quite happily. Also got a sophisticated infrastructure. We're seeing the signs of the crumbling, but a lot of it is still around and still available to be used in terms of communication networks, for example, transport networks, and so on. And finally, this is a high-pressure environment, so it's in some ways quite different to what you have if you're living in a stable, developed economy, where you've got time to think about things, to work out, complicated solutions. Here you don't. Everything has to be done fast, and it has to be successful, and it has to be made to work. So those are my thoughts on what makes South Africa distinctive, on the social drivers of Bitcoin in South Africa. My time is up, and I thank you very much for your attention, and welcome your questions afterwards.
so good. That was really interesting. Thank you so much. So interesting. And I can't believe that he managed to time the blackout, the load shedding for the talk. He paid off ESCOM to do that, you know. Yeah, round of applause just for that moment. That was perfect. I'm joking. No, but seriously, that was thought-provoking, and it made me think about my own country and how we, in some ways, have similar problems to what South Africa is now experiencing. And it feels like the UK, to an extent, is going that path of South Africa in terms of crumbling infrastructure, increasing corruption, increasing inequality, and of course increasing reliance on these government handouts, and this sort of general malaise about trying to make a change or question our authority. The problem with the UK is that we don't have some of these solutions that John alludes to, such as, you know, we don't have high levels of distrust of government, we don't have strong civil society organisations just yet, and I guess the biggest thing that England doesn't have is a national rugby team that will just not stop winning World Cups. So kudos to you guys. Okay,